Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Wall. Well, today we're diving into a critical and all too familiar issue affecting athletes and active individuals, concussions. With an estimated 300,000 reported cases in Canada every year and a growing awareness about the long-term effects of repeated head injuries, it's essential to understand the risks associated with concussions and how to prevent them. A concussion is a type of traumatic brain injury that occurs when the brain is jolted or shaken inside the skull. Now, this can happen as a result of a direct blow to the head or even just a hard jolt in the body that causes the head to move rapidly. Now, concussions can range from mild to severe, and symptoms can include headaches, dizziness, confusion, memory loss, and even unconsciousness. In some cases, the effects of a concussion can last for days, weeks, months, or even a lifetime, and can lead to a long-term impact on the individual's health and quality of life. So today we're going to not only talk about concussions, but brain injuries as a whole, and we have three great experts to join us. Our first guest is Cassandra Stockley, who's the coordinator of programs and services at the NL Brain Injury Association. Cassandra specializes in brain injuries, wellness, and advocating for her clients, and will tell us more about the NL Brain Injury Association and their upcoming fundraiser, which I'll be involved with. Next, we'll chat with Nick Mercer, who's a true champion and advocate for brain injuries and concussions. Now, Nick is the host and founder of the Concussion Talks podcast and is joining us today to share his personal story. Nick was involved in a biking accident in BC and was in a coma for over 2 weeks after suffering a severe brain injury. Now, despite a long road to recovery, Nick has become an advocate for brain injury and is dedicated to raising awareness around the importance of concussion safety. Our final guest is Ashley Hiscock. She's a certified athletic therapist with Premier Athletic Therapy and Sports Medicine, and she works with a variety of brain injury and concussion victims. She'll share her knowledge about the symptoms and effects of concussions, as well as tips for preventing and managing these injuries. We have a lot to cover, so let's get to it. Hi, Cassandra. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us today. It's always nice to have people that are experts and people that are representing the individuals we're talking about. Today, we're talking about concussions and brain injury. So can you tell me a little bit about your organization and what you guys do?
Yeah, so I'm part of the Newfoundland Labrador Brain Injury Association, and we are a local nonprofit located here in St. John's, but we actually service the entire province. We help provide supports to individuals who have suffered brain injury, as well as their friends and family. And we also educate the general public about brain injury, its effects, prevention, and those sort of things, because there's not a lot of general knowledge about the area, unfortunately. So we do our best to help with.
Yeah, it's one of those things people can't prepare for. It's not something, typically you see coming. It could be happening from an accident, things like that. What's your role at the organization?
Yes, I'm the coordinator of programs and services. I'm actually the only full-time staff at the moment.
Yeah.
So I kind of help with individuals who have suffered a brain injury. I help kind of navigate the system for them because it's very overwhelming. There are some services available, but not the amount that would be preferable, of course. So I kind of help individuals navigate through those and figure out what may be best. But we also have a support and recreation group called ABLE for brain injury survivors. And we also do educational presentations and those things.
Wow. Yeah, I guess it's such a broad variety of conditions that you guys would see on a day-to-day basis. We're going to talk a lot about concussions today, but what other types of brain injuries do people come present with you guys and need some help with?
Yeah, so we actually see a wide variety of different types of brain injury, concussion, which you've already mentioned. We also see aneurysms, strokes. There could be people who have been born with brain injuries due to different conditions, different infections which lead to brain injuries. So it's really a wide variety for sure.
Mm-hmm. Does Guillain-Barré's fall into that sort of category, or is that a separate thing?
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. We definitely don't limit anything
Yeah.
here. We do our best to ensure we're inclusive. So any type of brain injury imaginable, we do our best to help you out.
Well, that's great. Since we've been introduced, I had an individual ask me today about his partner who had a brain aneurysm. So it's nice to know those resources exist. And I think that's an important aspect to understand, is just how common different brain injuries are. Do you have any statistics about Canada and how it relates?
Yeah, so actually, the statistics for Canada are extrapolated from United States studies because there isn't really much done. However, they look at our population, and it's estimated that there's over 1.5 million Canadians living with brain injury. However, those statistics may not be entirely accurate as it's not really studied here in Canada, and it definitely should be because it would definitely help us out. And in terms of things such as concussion, those aren't always diagnosed. They can look at data from hospital rooms and that sort of thing. But if you're going to a doctor's office or if you're not even recognizing you have a concussion, those results aren't included in the statistics.
So it's extremely common, I guess, like it's something that can occur from any number of things that happen in our day-to-day life, from an accident. We're going to learn about Nick, how he was on a bike and injured himself that way. People get in car accidents, but it can also be genetic things, like you said, like aneurysms. So, you said you're the only full-time person there, but you guys have a pretty robust organization that you've got board members. Tell me who's involved with making things work over there.
Yeah, so we have a volunteer board of directors who are really awesome. We have a president, a vice president, treasurer, secretary, as well as some directors, and they kind of all steer the direction of where we're going as an organization. And we also have a group of volunteers who are mainly MUN students who are interested in brain injury, and they also help us out with our programs and initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Are there any stories of people that really sort of stand out to you about how you guys have been able to assist them in navigating probably one of the most challenging times of their life?
Yeah, for sure. We actually have an ABLE program, which I already previously mentioned, that meets once a week on Thursday afternoons. And I've gotten to know those participants fairly well. The majority that are coming now have been coming since June of last year. That's kind of when we started getting things back up and rolling after COVID kind of put a little bit of a damper on everything. And those participants, just seeing them week in and week out, are always so happy to come here. So it's always nice to see an individual and their growth over time and how happy they are for something as simple as participating in a craft once a week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, community is such an important thing. I think we all saw what happened to us during the pandemic when we were removed from one another. And imagine throwing a complex condition like a brain injury on top of it. I can see why that's such a valuable tool. And that's one of the things is that you guys are a nonprofit. So you guys, are benefiting from fundraising activities and charitable donations. You guys have a dinner dance coming up. Tell me a bit about that.
Yes, so we're having a fundraising dinner and dance on February 10th at the Legion on Black Marsh Road. And we're hoping that we will be able to raise enough funds to help us continue with our programs and services because there's so many gaps in the healthcare system. We want to help bridge those. So tickets are $60 each, or you can get a table of 8 for $450. We have dinner entertainment. We have a guest speaker, which is actually you. So thank you so much for that.
No problem.
Yeah, and we also have some dance music, silent auction, and a 50-50 draw. So we're hoping it's going to be a fun night.
Yeah, it will be. I'm really looking forward to it. So it's gonna be great. And I got a nice little chat lined up for everybody. So it should be nice to see folks get out, be a little bit social, and have a good time while we raise money for a really great cause. And before we go, can you tell me how people can get those tickets?
Oh, yes, of course. So they can reach out to us via email at info@nlbia.ca, or they can call our office at 709-221-1288.
Sandra, thank you so much for joining me today. And thanks for sharing so much about your organization.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's Cassandra Stockley from the NL Brain Injury Association. When we come back, we'll chat with Nick Mercer, who's the host of the Concussion Talks podcast, about his story and his show. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. We're here with Nick Mercer, who's a true champion and advocate for brain injury awareness. Now, Nick is the host and founder of the Concussion Talks podcast and is joining us today to share his personal story. Nick was involved in a biking accident in BC and was in a coma for 2 weeks after suffering a severe brain injury. Despite a long road to recovery, Nick has become an advocate for brain injury and is dedicated to raising awareness around the importance of concussion safety. Let's check it out. Hi, Nick. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, and it was great talking to you on my podcast just then. So
I know. Why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we both have each other on? I mean,
this is great. This is awesome. So,
well, you know what? I get the easier job this time. Because
yeah, exactly.
I get to ask the questions. The guy get to play host to the host himself, which is kind of probably a different role for you in a lot of ways.
Well, I've done it a few times, but again, not much. Like this is fun. This is more fun to do. Like on this side.
Wicked. Well, that's what I was hoping we could talk about today. So I'm going to be speaking at the Brain Injury Association dinner coming up. It is a perfect time to talk about, brain injury, concussions, things like that. You have a podcast dedicated to this. Tell me a bit about your podcast, and then maybe after that we can talk a little bit about your story.
Well, kind of actually kind of almost melded into one, but my podcast came from in 2010. I moved back here, so I started a blog, and then that I had that for 5 years. So 2010, almost exactly 5 years, 2010 until 2015. Then 2015, I started podcasts are pretty cool. Just do that. So that's why I started the podcast. And and there's just like it's called like concussion doc from my blog. Started off just writing, actually not talking. Just it really worked out well. Those talk.
That's great. Well, that's the thing. And you've talked a lot. There's been lots of stories on you over the years about, the traumatic accident that occurred for you. Tell me about that story and maybe a little bit of a lead up, because you were a really high level athlete as well at the time too, right?
Well, I don't know what high level athlete, but I tried to stay fit. That's it. I played water polo from the age of 13 until 22. I didn't really stop. I paused, I guess. I want to try something new, but and then I took a triathlon in January of 2003. But before that, after I graduated from university, I did. Two friends and I biked across Canada, and we just one day we decided we were watching summertime. We were watching Tour de France. We were like, once there's the Tour de Canada, we're like, yeah, let's try it. So we just basically decided to try it. We said, we got to do, we'll try it. So that was in 2000, we said that. Then by 2002, when we graduated, we decided to give it a shot. And I decided to try triathlon when I went to BC, because I went to a master's degree at UVic. So I went to BC and did a master's and in public administration. And so I was out there and I started to do triathlons. So I was doing that. And then in that summer of 2003, so starting really May, we started doing one of these Friday morning rides, because late May we also started doing these swim practices outside at a lake in Victoria, Thetis Lake. So that day, that was actually a forest fire in BC, because BC, in 2003 was really dry, so there was tons of forest fires, and so we went on a different ride that morning, and I was going downhill, and I was going really quickly. I see it probably like 70 years, or 60, going pretty fast, and had a helmet on. But now I didn't have a helmet, I'd be dead. But I started to avoid someone to hit a tree with the helmet in my head, and if they came with not a helmet, then I'd be toast. So, helmet was important, and I ended up in a coma for 2 weeks, wow. And I spent 1 month in hospital, 5 months in inpatient rehab at the Miller Center here in St. John's, and then just more time recovering, rehab physio and outpatient physio, and doing other swimming and doing working out and stuff like that. So that was all very important. And and I'm nowhere near where I was, but like I said, I told you last August, I'm happy where I am. Like I'm improving. I'm not best shape ever, but I'm feeling fit, and I just came swimming, and I do yoga, and I walk a lot, and
wicked
swim when I can, and so
I love it. Well, I think that's part of it. I mean, when you first got injured, you probably weren't sure what your outlook was going to be like. What were people telling you versus what did you think was possible? It must have been a really challenging experience, like that I could never even fathom. But how did how did that go down?
It was difficult, but it was also difficult. Just people didn't tell me much. Doctors were talking more wisely to my parents and my sister and that who were hosting me, who actually understand it, because I was just out of a coma, and I was on all sorts of morphine or whatever, but I was on all sorts of drugs and stuff. So I was spaced. I couldn't tell you what my first memory was of a coma, for example. I just remember stuff randomly, whether I thought I had dreams in a coma, but I guess I didn't have dreams in my coma. I had dreams after my coma, but my parents were told that I would be a vegetable that I would never walk in. There's a 50-50 chance of me surviving. And because coma is not, whether or not it's medically induced or not, just it's in a dire straits there. So I was in that, and when I got to Mo Center, I remember a nurse just being really nice, just came in and talking, and she was saying, "You'll walk out of here. At least knows to go. It's all positive for things. Like maybe at the walker, and then but you'll walk out." And I was like, then I got really depressed. I was like, I'm never going to walk like alone again. I was like, got really, really sad. I remember that night. I was like, I called my parents at like later, not like late, but like it was like after visiting hours. I guess visiting hours, but like I guess visiting hours. And I had a good support network who was just saying, "Oh, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. You'll be okay." And she's just being nice, or he's just being nice, and he says that, or just trying to be helpful. And then if I sticking with it, but you need time to actually heal stuff.
I guess, was that one of the motivations that you had when you started to do these things? And this is one of the things I talked about in your podcast, was that you had this physical literacy, you had this athleticism about yourself, that you knew how to do different things with your body. When you started to see some of that function restoring over time, was what helped you kind of bring yourself out of that? And how important was it?
Yeah, no, exactly. Like I think we're saying, because I got like just so much. I can understand what physios and OTs to a point, but in more of my physios were telling me about what to move and how to move it and what to do here, and not those necessarily complicated terms they're using, but like medical terms. So they're just being this like, use this, move this arm, and balance this way, and I could understand what they're getting at, and also I did biology, so I kind of, that's my undergrads in biology, so I understood the actual mechanics and the actual physiology of it a bit more, but still, but also by my physical literacy of being on the bike and swimming, really know how your body is, where your body's in space, the proprioception was so good then, and it does, like when the physio would say do this or do this, and I did it, and I can move, and I felt like. And they were like, "Oh, last time you did this happened, and this time you're doing it better for both reasons, whatever reason." And that would make me, that would really inspire me, I guess, and egg me on to do more, just to challenge myself more, and just what I can do and where I can go, and even if it wasn't going with running or cycling again or swimming properly again, I could at least was encouraged by the fact that I could move a certain way, and it was better than it was like just even like a week before. A week before, I was just, "Oh, this is better today. It's better," and that's encouraging, because that stepwise, just it will get better.
Well, yeah, it sounds like you've been able to regain a good majority of your physical function back. Obviously, your cognitive function is back. You've got your radio show or your podcast as well, so you've been able to really get through that. If somebody is listening to this and they're either somebody who has had a brain injury or somebody who's part of a social network, or a family members have one, what advice would you give them about the recovery process and what's possible?
Recovery process, the thing I think most of the recovery process is, although I'm talking about like stepwise improvements, it's not a stepwise process. So like you'll have good days and bad days, and necessarily just because you went up, like you improve, you make like noticeable improvements for like 3 weeks in a row, but then get nothing for 2 months or a month or whatever. That's not the end of the world. It's like that's what happens. Like you're not gonna always, if you just always get better every single time you do it, then no injury be anything. It'd be, and all injuries be the same. Just be, you just do this and you do this, and you just stepwise go up. But brain injury is obviously one is a tricky one too, because there's so many different symptoms and so many different signs of it that are just. But I would say most important thing to remember is that it's not stepwise. It's just it's not a single trajectory. So you may plateau a bit. You may even feel like and by plateauing for a bit, you feel like you're going down. Feel like you're maybe not. You're just like, you feel like you are, because you're expecting improvements and you were improving, and then you're not, and you feel like, oh, well, then therefore I'm you feel like you're deteriorating. So it is a struggle. It's not like I'm not trying to. I'm not sugarcoat and say, oh, everything's gonna be okay, because sometimes some functions are not going to come back the way you anticipate. But you're still in your life, and you're still like, there's still so much you can do. It's just like even limited, even for you. I mean, how much, I don't know. It depends on how much you expect. But that's not to say you shouldn't expect anything, because that's out of your life, and that's sad. I'm trying to get my head in the picture. But,
it's all different. Yeah, it's all different too. Like, so okay, so one of the things you've done is you've made a significant difference. You've been an advocate for increasing education, for helping people navigate things, to becoming an expert in reaching out and having, you've had well over 100 episodes of your podcast. Yeah. How has being an advocate helped you, and how do you think it's helped the people that listen to what you do? Because that has to mean a lot to you. I think it would, at least.
It does. It really does. I mean, because it's hard to say. I know I reach a lot of people with my podcast, and I get a lot of saying like, "Oh, it's great. Thank you so much for doing this." But it's also great to hear when I suggest, or someone says, someone wrote me a while ago from like Ohio, I think, that thank her for she's an OT or psychology. No, social work. It's only that social work OT, and she got so many connections out of listening to my podcast. So many people. So it's just good that even if for brain injury people, for anyone's had a concussion or brain injury, then it's great for them to hear the stories about positive influences, or even just I into a lot of like scientists and research and athletes. Well, not many athletes, but research and stuff, and that, so it may not be stories that they usually want to find soothing, but the idea that there are people looking to improve this, and that there are different aspects, and that people can, like I said, that person who said she found a lot of contacts. That's another thing. Like people who aren't necessarily even brain injured find good help from just connecting with people and improving the lives of brain injured people through their own research, and through extending their reach and their research, I guess.
Well, you said it right. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are health professionals, for example, and so they're dealing with people with brain injuries or concussions, nurses, physiotherapists, OTs, researchers, family members, people that had these injuries themselves. And so, I really appreciate what you do, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us today on the show, and for sharing your story, and also for helping coordinate our other guests that are expert in this. So, much appreciated, and I'm sure I'll see you back here again soon.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. And thank you. And I'll be actually introducing you next Friday.
Perfect.
At our dinner. So I will definitely be talking to you, and this was great. So, and thank you so much again for being on my show. So, yes, thank you.
Talk soon. Take care. Well, that was Nick Mercer. When we come back, we'll chat with Ashley Hiscock from Premier Athletic Therapy and Sports Medicine. Now, she's a certified athletic therapist who works with brain injury and concussion victims. She'll share her knowledge about the symptoms and effects of concussions, as well as tips for preventing and managing these injuries. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. We're here with Ashley Hiscock from Premier Athletic Therapy and Sports Medicine. She's a certified athletic therapist who works with brain injury and concussion victims. She's sharing her knowledge about the symptoms and effects of concussions, as well as tips for preventing and managing these injuries. Let's check it out. Hi, Angela. Welcome to the show.
Oh, hi. Thanks for having me. This is great.
Oh, it's great to talk to somebody like yourself. You are an expert athletic therapist. You have your own practice. And, we're going to talk about concussions today. And, when I think about concussions, I think about athletes these days and all the injuries, but there's also brain injuries that can occur from different events. Maybe you can give me a bit of a background in what a concussion is and start right from the ground.
Absolutely. So a concussion is actually a mild traumatic brain injury, which takes place when there's a biomechanical force applied or received, I guess, to the head, face, or neck directly. And then you have your indirect forces, which, maybe you've gotten a hit, like maybe you're a football player, you've been hit in the shoulder, but your neck and head kind of make a snapping motion, and then you have that whiplash mechanism, which can result in a concussion as well. So it doesn't always have to be directly to your head. You don't have to hit your head, which a lot of people think that you do, but it can happen via indirect or direct forces.
Well, maybe we could talk a tiny bit about anatomy on this and like how the brain sits in the head and why it can move around and bang against the skull and all these different things that can cause a concussion. Because I think for a lot of people, we don't realize that, that's kind of like floating around in there kind of.
It is, yeah. So you have your skull, which is obviously, a rigid tissue in your body, and your brain sits inside of there, but it's kind of suspended. So you have the cerebrospinal fluid that's kind of cushioning the space between your brain and your skull. And of course, it's not a large space, but it's just big enough that, if your head is moving around, that your brain is, I always say sloshing around. It's not sloshing around, but it has that minor bit of movement between that space in your skull. And so when you get those movements, or sometimes those twisting movements, if it's rotational, then you have this very microscopic damage to the axons of the brain that make up the brain. And that's where you get these concussion symptoms.
Right. Okay. So when I think about, that sounds like a lot of people get hit their head and bang their head. And I think a lot of people have heard of having concussions. How common is it? And how many people do you see coming through your doors with minor or serious concussions?
I think it's probably a lot more common than people realize. I think once you start educating people in how they happen and then how they feel or the symptoms that they're having, people are often like, geez, I wonder how many I had throughout my life and didn't even realize that I had them. So, in not my past life, but in part of my practice, I do some strength training for people who have been involved in motor vehicle accidents as well. And so often I ask them, have you been diagnosed with a concussion if they've been, rear-ended and had a whiplash mechanism? And they often say like, no, I wasn't diagnosed, but then I'll kind of ask them, do you have these symptoms or those symptoms? And, I'm not able to diagnose people with conditions, but I'll often say, I suspect that you probably did sustain a concussion. And so therefore I'm going to treat it. And, sometimes there's no special treatment for that. It just comes along with the rest of their rehab, but it's not something that they realized would have been possible. Often the first thing they say is like, well, I didn't hit my head. And so going back to that first, question that we discussed, it's like, well, you don't have to. And I think that's the biggest thing. It's just lack of education.
Yeah. Well, and you said some things that were really important. I think we should cover those right now. And that was that, they didn't recognize the signs and the symptoms. So why don't you walk us through some of these common signs and symptoms? So if anybody's listening, they might be able to recognize them themselves or others.
For sure. So right now, as it stands, there's about 21, 22 different signs and symptoms that people can experience when it comes to concussion. So it's not always straightforward. The most common ones I'll see are headache, of course, along with, some dizziness. You can also be sensitive to light, sensitive to noise. Some people will have a ringing in their ears or tinnitus. Some people, it really affects their emotions. So they become more irritable, they become more sad, more depressed. And then some people, it really affects their sleep. And some people really have a hard time describing it and will just often say like, I just don't feel right. There's something not right. I don't have any of those other symptoms and I can't describe what it is, but there's something just not quite right. And so that's where it gets a bit tricky, especially if they didn't sustain a hit to their head or they don't recognize that maybe they had a whiplash mechanism or a rotational force through their head. So really having a good set of questions and knowing what you're looking for and recognizing that not feeling right can fit into that symptomology.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good to know. And you said earlier that, it is a minor form of brain injury. So, can the brain heal from these? Like you said, there's a rehab process, but like, how does that work and how long does it take?
What the research is showing is, the brain can heal between these incidents, but it's also really important to allow the brain to heal between those injuries. Hopefully you never have multiple concussions, but if you do, as long as there's healing happening in between and that issue resolves, it's not as significant. Just like if you sprained your ankle, it's much worse if you are in the middle of your rehab for an ankle sprain and then you tend to do it again. You're like, oh, I'm back to square one and maybe worse off. Same thing with the brain. So it's, the quickest return to play, as I call it, for a a concussion is going to be about a week.
Mm-hmm.
And that's getting back from doing what you were doing and doing it to 100%.
Yep.
Some people will take longer. Some people may feel much better within a couple of days. Most concussions will resolve on their own within 7 to 10 days. That's kind of the natural resolution for those injuries.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, everyone's different. So we look at about a week, but typically maybe a few days, few days longer.
Yeah. Okay. So is there different levels or grades of concussion? And, at what point should somebody think about going and getting medical treatment instead of, trying to walk it off, basically?
Yeah. The experts in concussion now have kind of done away with the grading of concussions. You still look at things that, if someone was knocked out, if something functionally was disrupted that badly, I personally tend to put that in a bit of a different category that's a little more serious. If everything shut down for a second or a couple of minutes,
Mm-hmm.
That's more serious. Most people aren't losing consciousness, thank goodness, with a concussion. So for most people, like I said, the typical resolution time will be about 7 to 10 days. If somebody is starting to experience symptoms for longer than that, that's usually when I would recommend they see somebody, whether that's an athletic therapist like myself or somebody else who's, well-versed in concussion rehab and return to play. That's usually that time frame that you want to look at. In children, it can be a little bit longer. So the recommended guidelines are that in kids younger than 14 years old, that will typically resolve in about 30 days. Okay. So, the education piece is big there. So if you have a parent who's obviously very concerned about their child, you have to kind of, let them know that a month is a pretty typical waiting time. And for adults, it's a little less so. And you're hoping for that early resolution and that things kind of resolve on their own. But it's when things start to linger that I usually recommend stepping in.
Yeah, and you basically said that you need to seek out somebody who's specialized in this. So I think the first thing before we give any advice whatsoever is to clarify that seeing somebody who's an expert in this, if you are suffering from a concussion or a medical condition of any sort, is always the most important thing. But if you were to walk me through how the recovery process would happen or what you would do for somebody for rehabilitating them, whether that be an athlete or somebody got in a motor vehicle accident, how would that look and what would occur?
Typically, what I like to do is we have a tool is called a sport concussion assessment tool. And those are updated every 4 to 5 years, just with like the newest research and what you should be looking for. So I'll usually do that questionnaire. It involves, a list of symptoms as well as the severity of the symptoms. So you're looking hopefully to see that those symptoms are resolving with time. So I'll ask those questions. There's also some simple like memory and cognitive tests on that as well that you ask. And I like to do them. Sometimes we do them as baseline tests for people who are involved in contact sports. So you kind of have a baseline of what they can do. Some people historically do really terribly on those tests. Right. So you don't want to assume that if they have a suspected head injury that it's terrible because of that head injury. They may have been really bad at it beforehand. So you try not to put too much faith in those. But it is a nice reference to have. But, testing out concentration, memory, testing balance, making sure people can track with their eyes without it causing like double vision or much more serious symptoms. And then doing some like delayed memory recall. So asking them a question earlier in the test and then re-asking that question later to see if they're able to recall, 5 to 7 minutes later versus, in the moment when you asked them earlier. Yeah. So that's typically how I start out with the concussion assessments that I do. And then I'll also evaluate their neck. If not going down further through the spine, but especially for those people who've had a whiplash mechanism or some sort of, tackle or force through their body where their head kind of got tossed around a little bit. I just want to make sure that their neck is working appropriately as well, because some concussion symptoms are also similar to cervicogenic symptoms. So if people have really tight muscles in their neck, then sometimes that can cause a headache. Maybe it's not a concussion at all. And so that's where you really want to be careful that you're not saying, well, you actually have a concussion when that's not true, or completely ignoring their neck when that's the source of their symptoms.
We're here with Ashley Hiscock from Premier Athletic Therapy and Sports Medicine. She's a certified athletic therapist who works with brain injury and concussion victims. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. We're here with Ashley Hiscock from Premier Athletic Therapy and Sports Medicine. She's a certified athletic therapist who works with brain injury and concussion victims. She's sharing her knowledge about the symptoms and effects of concussions, as well as tips for preventing and managing these injuries. Let's check it out. I guess one of the things that would be common for a lot of people is we think about some of our favorite athletes that have had several concussions, and you think about what's happened with American football, for example, with people's brains. Maybe you could talk about what happens when we've had these repetitive concussions and why that can hold a risk for us.
Well, like I said earlier, you really want to respect the healing time of the brain in those situations. So I think the other contributing factor to some of these concussions are if you're looking at subconcussive forces. And so the research, I don't want to say is like completely out on this, but it's more difficult to evaluate. So you have people who play football in the United States from the time that they're probably 3 years old. Mm-hmm. And, I think it's changing a little bit now. The culture is changing. We know that football causes long-term brain injuries and much more serious, honestly, than concussions when you look at CTE and, the wild things, unfortunately, that can make you do. So in earlier years, like those 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds were tackling each other, just like professional football players are tackling each other. So you look at all of those forces where nobody was injured at the time, but you add them up over the course of a month, and then you're probably looking at like hundreds of subconcussive forces, and they add up over time. So you have people, or I've seen people who are soccer players and they head the ball and they say, you know what, after X number of times doing that in a game, I have to stop because I'm starting to feel not good, whether I'm getting a headache. But, the force of the ball's pretty light, but that force, that repetitive force of the ball striking their head starts to bother them. So that force is adding up, even over the course of a 90-minute soccer game. And so, like I said, to me, CTE is much scarier than a concussion because, you're not picking up on CTE early, and you can't look at it until that person unfortunately has passed away and you can examine their brain. So you want to deal with these things early, as early as possible, and make sure that you can help resolve them as best you can.
So we can go down that rabbit hole of that, but essentially I heard the story of how that was first discovered from a family member who did an autopsy and requested the body back, and then they started to request it from all the football players that died at an early age or had challenges through life. So it's very, very troubling conditions that can happen with that. So if we look at what concussions are, we know that we can't avoid necessarily a car accident because this is an accident or some of these concussive forces, but what can people do to protect their brain to make sure that they're not putting themselves at increased risk in case something happens? I know, for example, Nick was wearing a helmet when he got his accident. Like, what would you recommend for people?
For sure. And I think in those high contact sports like hockey, football, obviously a helmet is, imperative at this point. And, back when, even in the 90s, you were still seeing hockey players who were grandfathered into not having to wear their helmet, which is insane to think about now. Realistically, the way I look at it is that a helmet protects your skull. So it's going to protect you from, taking a puck to the head and, lacerating your scalp, which is a, really easy bleeder. So taking care of that. Unfortunately, a helmet's not going to stop your brain from having that movement inside of your skull. So that's where a lot of people, and they'll say, well, I was wearing a helmet. It's like, right. But unfortunately, that movement still occurs within your head. So while it's great that you're wearing your helmet and you should continue to do so, that's eliminating a certain type of injury. And unfortunately, concussion is likely not one of them. I know a few years ago, research into, creating a concussion helmet was really big. And, there were certain models that I had heard of that I was like, that actually sounds amazing and probably would stop that movement to some extent. I don't know if it's ever going to be possible to stop it altogether. But really interesting stuff. The other thing is it's more common. I believe concussions are more common in women. And so they don't exactly know, but they have mentioned like neck circumference, I believe, or neck strength. And maybe those go hand in hand as perhaps why that's happening. So again, if you look at that whiplash mechanism, and if women typically have a smaller neck and therefore smaller musculature, is a lack of neck strength contributing to their likelihood of sustaining a concussion, which I find really interesting. So, obviously you can't condition your brain to take higher forces, but it's a matter of perhaps just keeping your body strong and specifically, keeping your neck strong so that if something does happen, that your muscles and, kind of soften that blow, if so to speak.
That makes perfect sense to me. That makes perfect sense. So if somebody's listening, obviously you're well versed in the topic, this is what you do. If they need some help, how can they reach out to you in your clinic?
Yeah, so I work at Premier Athletic Therapy and Sports Medicine, which is located in the West End of St. John's. And we're also on social media, so Facebook and Instagram. I have a professional Instagram account for myself, and it's the Upside Down AT. So really into gymnastics and upside down sports. So that's what I do. But yeah, so reaching out through social media or giving us a call can get you an appointment to see myself.
It's fantastic. That's great. And, as we're winding down here, is there anything you'd like to leave people with on this topic and closing remarks?
I guess the biggest thing for me is education. So concussions are like any other injury. And if you take care of them, they do get better as long as you seek out the right information. And that's not always easy to find. Again, ideally, you don't get multiple concussions, just like you don't break your leg multiple times. But if you do and you take care of it, life can be normal.
Good. Well, that's great to hear. And, that I appreciate you and you saying, finding the right information, which is why it's so great you could be here today as an expert to be able to share what we need to know. So thanks for joining me. And maybe I'll see you at the Brain Injury Association dinner.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you to my guests for joining me today. I hope that you learned something new and gained a deeper understanding of the challenges and impacts that brain injury conditions can have on individuals and their families. Now, if you or someone you know is affected by brain injury or concussion, remember that there's help and support available through the NL Brain Injury Association. Also remember, if you want to support a great cause and have a fun time, they have a charity dinner next weekend, and you can reach out to them on their website to get more information. Well, that's our show this week. Thank you for joining me. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Wall. We'll see you back here next week for another episode of The Wall Show on your VOCM.